So, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm very honored to introduce this lecture today. It will be a lecture by American philosopher and literary theorist Professor Gregga Lamberta, who came to see us to Prague. So he will speak today about the creation of concepts, and subtitle is Freud, Kant, Deleuze. So this strange composition maybe of authors put together, and I hope it will bring a lot of inputs and discussion. So I would be very happy if you share your opinions and your thoughts about this topic. So please feel free to discuss with Gregg and to share your ideas in a discussion. And just a few words about Gregg Lambert. I think you all know him, so it won't be very long, but just to say something to introduce our speaker today. So Gregg Lambert is an American philosopher and literary theorist who writes on Baroque and Neo-Baroque, but also about contemporary university, and he especially works on the philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Jacques Derrida, and Félix Guattari with Gilles Deleuze. So this is his specialization, and he's also the founding director of Syracuse University Humanities Center, where he currently holds the distinguished research appointment as Dean's Professor of Humanities, and was principal investigator and founding director of the Central New York University's corridor. So I had to read this because I didn't want to make a mistake. So this is his position, and this is his specialization, and I won't continue to present Gregg because I think you all know him. So I would like to invite Gregg to speak now. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michaela. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased after this long, cold pandemic season is hopefully over, but we wait for the flu to end. To be able to, my first trip or my first visit is to come back to Prague, which is my favorite city. And I think that this is the third time I've spoken in this room. The first time for Petr Kuba's conference that he organized on Kafka in 2012. And then I came back a couple times, and there was another Kafka conference organized by another Petr in the Czech Academy, and that was also, I was in this room. So I'm also pleased to come back to this room again, in a manner of kind of like repetition, but also a manner of starting over again. Which we all have to do, I think, from this point. So I'll just begin my talk. Hopefully it'll be less than an hour. This talk is a third part of a series of lectures on the question of grounding, Grund, the question of the principle of reason in philosophy, which is primarily focused on a rereading of Deleuze and Guattari's last collective work, What is Philosophy? The first two parts were delivered earlier this June for the Deleuze camp, which took place virtually in Prague and was organized by our esteemed colleague, Petr Kuba. And these seminars were primarily focused on the third chapter of What is Philosophy, Geophilosophy, where I argue that we find a new metaphysical principle of the ground in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, specifically around the figures of the earth and territory, and the concepts of re-territorialization and deterritorialization. So the first two lectures really kind of went into those concepts in their philosophy and why they are so crucial. Corresponding for them to a major question that they pose in the first chapter, in what way is philosophy still Greek? For the third part today, I will go back to the first chapter of the work, which is entitled, What is a Concept? And around the major claim that philosophy, which they define philosophy as nothing more than the creation of concepts. But before returning to read the first chapter of What is Philosophy on the question of what is a concept, I must first go back a bit and review the preliminary exposition in Book 1 of the Critique of Pure Reason. Why? Because it's primarily around the Kantian innovation in this work that a major claim emerges that changed philosophy forever. That the claim that philosophers create concepts. Some would argue that the origin of this claim can be projected backward to the philosophies of Leibniz and Descartes, but the major claim, if not the requirement, of bringing all previous concepts that belong to philosophy since the Greeks and establishing them on a completely new ground, and at the same time purifying the ground of all illegitimate figures that were drawn from earlier mythic and religious sources, superstitions, is uniquely a Kantian foundation, active foundation and active grounding, that changed the task, or basically that defined the task of a critical philosophy. For example, one cannot imagine the philosophy of Hegel or even the philosophy of Heidegger could even exist without the Kantian precedent, who occupies the primary example of the statement that Deleuze and Guattari make in What is Philosophy, that only certain philosophers have changed what it actually means to think. This may come as a surprise to those who read Deleuze and Guattari or have read Deleuze and Guattari in the past, particularly Deleuze, and believe that Kant was always an enemy. There's a revaluation in Deleuze's later work of the position and the importance of Kant in his philosophy. Consequently, for the first part of my talk, I will briefly return to the Critique of Pure Reason alongside the transcript of a 1978 seminar in which Deleuze also decides at a certain point in his philosophical career to reread this text. Thus, as he lays out in the itinerary for the seminar, he foregrounds what he wants to illustrate and why he chooses to read Kant's first critique as the primary example of the creation of concepts. He says, quote, "Why is it that it was Kant who created the philosophical concepts of this new consciousness of time, making his philosophical expression possible? Does not concern us or in any way, or in any case, does not interest me. But what I would like to say is that indeed this sort of consciousness of time, which takes on a philosophical status in Kant, and which is completely new, I will proceed by numbered points because I'm always working with the idea that to each point corresponds a type of concept. Once again, I will be happy if you grant me at the end of these lessons that philosophers are precisely this, that they are no less creative than painters or musicians, simply that they create in a determinate domain that is the creation of concepts." Unquote. Immediately preceding the statement, Deleuze confesses that he had an incredible resistance to Kant's philosophy initially, or at least for a long time, in returning to this text in particular, which he hadn't read since the 1950s. This also has to do with another side of creation that we'll need to consider as the dangerous psychological effect of the creative persona of both the philosopher and the artist, including the writer, of course, which is the potentially schizophrenic dimension that can sometimes appear quite threatening to most of us normal neurotic individual types. In my recent book, in the meditation on the concept of becoming animal, I've addressed this around Freud's seminal essay on Da Vinci to understand the true nature of this threat, or of this notion of schizophrenia. At the very beginning of the seminar, Deleuze confesses his own inhibition as follows, quote, "We are returning to Kant. May this be an occasion for you to skim, read, or reread the Critique of Pure Reason. There is no doubt that a tremendous event in philosophy happens with this idea of critique. In going into it ourselves, or in going back into it, I had stopped reading it for a long time, and I read it again for you, I must say. It must be said that for me, it's a completely stifling philosophy. It's an excessive atmosphere, but if one holds up, and the important thing above all is, and this is an important statement, the important thing in reading Kant above all is not to understand Kant. The important thing is to take the rhythm of the given man, of a given writer, of a given philosopher. If one holds up, all this northern fog which lands on top of us starts to dissipate. And underneath there is an amazing architecture. When I said to you that a great philosopher is nevertheless someone who invents concepts, in Kant's case, in this fog, there functions a sort of thinking machine, a sort of creation of concepts that's absolutely frightening, unquote. This is a very amusing description of Kantian philosophy, of course, and Deleuze later repeats the same metaphor in interviews as well as in the pages of What is Philosophy. Kant is a great fog that rolled across the European continent at the end of the 18th century, coming in from the north. The the fog from Königsberg. I would simply view these forms of prejudice that prevented him from rereading Kant for a long time, at least since the early 60s when he first wrote his little primer on, quote, an enemy, to help prepare the students for the philosophy exams in France. Of course, the reference to fog, to the great fog, is also implicitly an allusion to the first description of the castle by Kafka, or K. Quote, there was nothing to be seen of the castle mount, for mist and darkness surrounded it, and not the faintest glimmer of light showed where the great castle lay. K stood on the wooden bridge leading from the road to the village for a long time, looking up what seemed to be a great void, unquote. A fog appears impenetrable, or like a unified mass, only from a distance, or perhaps from below, as in the case of K, who sees only a great void. Either that, or when you're completely enveloped, there seems to be nowhere outside the fog, a void. Thus, it's crucial to bear in mind when Deleuze says, when you must read the Critique of Pure Reason, not to understand it, but the minute you think you understand, you are already inside a terrifying thinking machine, and your understanding is no longer yours. It no longer belongs to you. Since the one who says I is an other, merely the effect of the machine itself. And this is what Deleuze describes as this notion of that when you read Kant, when you assemble his system, the I or the subject is the machine, is the reason itself that speaks through you. Your understanding then is the understanding of the system. However, when you get underneath the fog or the apparatus, which also implies when you view it up close and discern the relations of its various parts and how they function together, it is from that perspective or point of view you suddenly see an amazingly complex and intricate structure, like a mandala. This would be comparable to the change in K's perception of the castle after exploring its inner workings, its intricate and connecting parts. In short, the entire apparatus of the castle. This will also be the case with Deleuze's rereading of the Critique of Pure Reason once he holds up and gets past his first feeling of a stifling and excessive atmosphere of the work. I will not discuss his resistance to Kant any further here. I've written on it many places elsewhere. Instead, focus on what appears to be the effective response to Kant's philosophical system, which can be described as a kind of madness or controlled schizophrenia. Deleuze himself describes the Critique of Pure Reason as a kind of thinking machine that should not immediately be identified with the philosopher himself, but rather as an apparatus that functions independently of the subject, and whose construction exhibits a frightening productivity in the creation of new concepts that Deleuze and Guattari also locate in real schizophrenics. For example, the creation of Le Jeune Homme Schizophrène, or Joey the Machine Boy, who are key figures in the opening page of Anti-Oedipus. The mention of a thinking machine or writing machine should also recall the book on Kafka, Towards a Minor Literature, that Deleuze and Guattari wrote together just a year before Deleuze's seminar on Kant and on the concept. And perhaps it is this association that explains Deleuze's renewed interest in Kant, or maybe a sudden discovery of something he had never seen before, that there's a close relationship between Kafka and Kant in terms of the machine that they create or the function of what they call later on an assemblage. In any case, it will be my hypothesis, or rather, this is how I choose to interpret Deleuze's own reading of Kant's system at this point as a defense against madness. This is also one manner of interpreting the psychological motive for the creation of a concept, which is twofold. First, preventative, to shore up the object against the dangers of its loss as the result of delusion or madness, or what Kant calls Schwärmerei, fantasy, phantasm. Okay? Second, constructive or propedeutic, which is the love of the concept as a creative manner of libidinally retaining the object for the subject. So there's an attachment or a cathexis of the object through the concept. And as remember in the German, the concept is literally to grasp, begriffen. So to hold on to an object, to hold on to the empirical sensible plane. And of course, that's a pure description of the Kantian gesture, right? As Freud claimed, a strong egoism is a protection against falling ill, but we must begin to love in order not to fall ill. And we are bound to fall ill if, in the last resort, in the consequence of frustration, we are unable to love, unquote. In On Narcissism, Freud establishes the creation of the ego ideal in relation to what he calls the psychogenesis of creation, citing the following lines from the German Romantic poet Heinrich Heine. Illness was no doubt the final cause of the whole urge to create. By creating, I could recover. By creating, I became healthy, unquote. So you can see I'm setting up this psychoanalytic motivation for even Kant's system as a certain kind of understanding of the urge to create, which, as Deleuze says, philosophers create concepts very much in a different distinctive domain than painters and musicians create through the sensible plane as well. Perhaps this last association can produce an original insight into Kant's own psychological motivation for the construction of this monstrous, terrifying machine called the Critique of Pure Reason. That is, a fear of madness or schizophrenia, which actually he was later diagnosed with at the end of his life, dementia praecox, okay, and was always actually constantly fearful of falling mad, and this became a constant concern. He said he went to doctors and doctors didn't help him. Only philosophy would help him become healthy at one point in his biography. So, particularly in those cases where the concepts are created to belong to a vast system or apparatus that is laid over a plane of immanence to cover it entirely so that there are no gaps, no holes, no missing parts, until all its parts are completely unified like a body without organs. Here one might also think of the systems of Spinoza or Leibniz or even Hegel as well. Therefore, in what way can we understand the true function of a system is in some way to ward off madness? Or that Kant's Critique of Pure Reason might be comparable to an immense apparatus of the unconscious plumbing created by Joey, the schizophrenic boy, who is featured in the opening pages of Anti-Oedipus. So if we remember that the motive of the entire transcendental aesthetic is to establish, once again, to ground the reality of a priori concepts, categories. Moreover, to determine space as the a priori form of the object in general, and time is an a priori form of intuition that is internal to any subject whatsoever. Is this not a manner of demonstrating the reality of the object and the subject, or protecting it from the possibility of the universe that is simply chaotic and a bit like a schizophrenic's view of external reality, of a chaos that's constantly threatening to close in? That is a vast, intricate machine to protect this sense of reality from being swallowed up by the chaos that is always threatening to engulf the ground, but most importantly, protect their relation to the object from being determined by pure delusion, which we should remember was always the primary motive of the Kantian system, to protect the categories or the concepts of metaphysics from pure delusion. So he literally says that this is the object of critique, by attaching them again to a sensible basis as a necessary condition of the concept. And I'll go into that with not go into it too much detail, so don't worry, I'm not going to now read the entire Critique of Pure Reason for you again, but I'll try to outline some aspects purely from the function of trying to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. Therefore, as Kant concludes the introduction of the two parts of Book 1, quote, "The second part of the Transcendental Logic must be a critique of this dialectical illusion and is called the Transcendental Dialectic. It is not to be regarded as an art of dogmatically creating, irregen, such illusion, an art unfortunately quite prevalent in diverse cases of metaphysical jugglery, but as a critique of the power of the understanding and reason as regards to their hyperphysical uses. We need such a critique in order to uncover the false semblance, den Falschenschein, in the baseless pretensions of understanding and reason themselves. In other words, critique has to intervene to protect the concept from the powers of understanding and reason to fly off and basically create things outside of the domain of sensibility, which it supposedly accomplishes merely by using transcendental principles, and to claim instead that reason or understanding merely judges pure understanding and guards it against such sophical deception. Here, to understand exactly what Kant is claiming as a special power of critique, first of all, we need to recall that the transcendental logic is not defined as an analysis or dissection of given concepts as in a traditional logic, but instead performs, quote, the hitherto rarely attempted dissection of the power, Vermogen, of understanding itself. Of course, Vermogen is not a power defined as in the German Kraft, but as a wealth, as a bountiful, as a multiplicity. And the statement implies that the understanding has a wealth of powers or abilities. It is already composed of a multiplicity of powers. Likewise, Deleuze also says there are no simple concepts. Every concept is a multiplicity, although not all multiplicities are conceptual. In other words, Kant is stating that the act of understanding is already composed of multiple powers, but the critical power of understanding is the strongest power. In other words, Kant claims that through a critical use of judgment, the powers of both understanding and reason can be reduced merely to judgments. And so we can now define critique simply as the power of judgment that has been purified conceptually. In other words, what is called critique, critically defined, is nothing more than the power of pure judgment applied to concepts or with concepts. But what does critique need to purify? The answer? The power of understanding and reason themselves. Purify them of what? Clearly stated above, to purify understanding and reason of all of their pretensions to understand and to reason by pure metaphysical principles, that is, by metaphysical concepts. In short, their false semblance, as Kant says, den falschen Schein, in seeming more powerful than they actually are. Okay. So there's a real interesting play in Kant that he constantly calls attention to, this play of power, of the powers between the different aspects of understanding and reason themselves, and what constitutes the critical. And what I'm doing in this lecture, and I hope it won't be too dry, I'll get to the funny parts here pretty soon, is that I'm trying to dramatize what this difference is between critique in Kant and creation in Deleuze, and to try to kind of draw out that distinction, because I think it's an important distinction and one that we should not immediately think that we understand, given the fact that we have no idea what creation is, okay, most of us, until we actually create something, okay. So the idea that philosophy creates concepts is a little bit of a platitude, because you think, oh yeah, philosophy creates concepts. But then if you think about that statement a little bit, and you say, what does it mean to create a concept? And that's where Deleuze's work becomes much more difficult and problematic to enter into. And that's where he draws on the resources of art, of other creative practices, of art, painting, writing, in order to get some hints to answer the question what creation is, that he can apply then to philosophy itself. This becomes the true source of the conflict that has ensued for the last 200 years over the ground established by the Kantian critical philosophy. The critical power of the understanding to judge the other faculties, as well as their presentations of the objects of experience. If not experience itself, even though experience can neither be judged nor understood according to the Kantian requirement without concepts. Okay? Therefore, the major claim that pure concepts of reason are empty, just as pure intuitions with concepts are blind, can be classified as derogatory judgments of a critical understanding employed as rules for regulating the legitimate use for the creation of concepts to apply to experience and objects of understanding. As we will see, particularly in the case of Deleuze, this rule is severely disputed by Deleuze himself, in Deleuze's philosophy, and the understanding enters into a combat with the power of the imagination in the creation of concepts. And this is the distinction between creation and critique. Kantian philosophy is critical, therefore judgmental. It is the power to judge. Okay? Deleuze is saying that power is demoted in his philosophy in relation to a creative power which is drawn from the imagination. It is the power to create. Okay, so again, we shouldn't immediately think we understand what those statements mean. And so I'll play a little bit more with this. At this point, however, so as not to continue to go over the same old ground again as been done for countless times over the past 200 years of philosophical commentary, I will now switch to Deleuze and Guattari's version of the same ground, or the principle of reason, in order to prove that they share the same problematic as I've outlined in Kant, even though they renamed the object of the problematic immanence rather than transcendence. In some way, the only difference between Deleuze and Guattari, or Deleuze's philosophy and Kantian philosophy, is the plane of immanence versus the plane of transcendence that Kantian defines. So, but it's the same problematic, and this is what I will show. Simply to call it immanence doesn't really change anything until we understand the concept of immanence. Okay? So, quote, the plane of immanence is surrounded by illusions. These are not abstract misunderstandings or external pressures, but rather thought's own mirages, thought's own power of deluding itself. It is indeed necessary, and at least, in part at least, that illusions arise from the plane itself, like vapors from a pond, like pre-Socratic exhalations, giving off by transformation of the elements that are always at work on the plane. So in some ways they're describing that illusions arise from the plane of immanence itself, like a bit like vapors from a pond, okay? And so this is a problem of being able to perceive them. In other words, what Kant invokes is the problem of pure understanding, which refers to the whole understanding constituted by multiple powers and existing a priori concepts, is simply what Deleuze and Guattari call the plane of immanence. That is, the image of thought that thinking gives to itself or affects itself with in order to think. Secondly, what Kant calls the problem of metaphysics is what they also refer to as the problem of both innate and transcendental illusions that are always found to be at work on the same plane that is already populated by existing concepts. Okay? Following Kant's own classification of the fundamental illusions, moreover, they go on to immediately list 4 species of illusions, the Falschenschein in Kant: transcendence, universals, eternity, and discursiveness. These are the 4 illusions in Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy? And if we had time, we could show they exactly correspond to the 4 kinds of illusions that appear in Kant. Nevertheless, it is this point we might also be able to discern a major difference in the method of the solution to the problem of metaphysical concepts. Whereas Kant's solution is the power of critique, Deleuze and Guattari's solution, or rather Deleuze's solution primarily, is an appeal to the power of creation. In other words, in response to the problem of metaphysical a priori concepts, Kant's solution is to purify these concepts so that they work properly in an apparatus according to the rules that he assigns them. Okay? Deleuze and Guattari's solution is simply to create new concepts, to replace the ones that are not working or broken with ones because they have too many illusions or produce too many illusions. In a certain sense, this would be the maximum of a Deleuzean style of critique, which he and Guattari call schizoanalysis. Okay? Which can be phrased, the maxim can be phrased as follows. If you find a concept that's not functioning properly, or causes the object to get lost in chaos, or thought threatens thought with falling back into chaos, into the vapors from which it emerged, or to lose the immanent plane of lived experience, there is only one solution: create a new concept, and hopefully a better one. Of course, this is easier said than done. that is, a technical problem of craft and handiwork, a skill, which requires a knowledge of how to create concepts. For example, one often creates with one's hands, after all, not just by thinking, okay? But this doesn't address the true nature of the problematic itself, and we shouldn't pretend that we immediately understand the difference between critique and creation as solutions that correspond to the same problematic. In fact, I would argue we don't even know what creation means in this context, and would already presuppose we know how to create concepts, or how creation of concepts is different from the processes of generalization or abstraction, or even requires a special power, like a genius, that is different from the activities of judging and evaluating, from the highly mental attitudes of contemplation and reflection. So in order to know that what creation is, we must first learn how to discern its difference from the other powers or activities that we associate often with thinking, but in a sense is not a creative power of thinking. So in a sense, what does it really mean to think, and how is it different from contemplation, reflection, abstraction, and these other mental activities that for centuries that we have mistaken for thinking, okay? And nevertheless, we have made some minimal progress over the last 2 minutes, or maybe the last 2 centuries. At least we have an answer to begin with in terms of what it is that we're looking for. Okay, what is the power? To expose this difference, allow me to illustrate. Now this is where my talk gets a little bit more illustrative, okay? Allow me to illustrate the following scenario. Imagine a painter, say Jackson Pollock, working on a canvas in his studio. After a full day, he finishes by climbing the stepladder that's placed in the middle of the studio and looking down, of course, on the canvas that's spread out or stretched out on the floor. You remember Pollock painted horizontally, right? Which is stretched out on the floor below him. Immediately, he judges it as a failure, owing to some element of the composition that he judges to be wrong. A wrong color splashed in the bottom left corner. A long thick spill of black where there should be only a series of splotches or dots, okay? A gray area in the middle of the composition where 2 colors collided accidentally and produced nothing but a blur that looks like a blotchy patch of mud or shit. What does Pollock do? He whitewashes the canvas to prepare to start over the next day. Or if the canvas is already burdened by too many previous failures, he rips it from its skeletal frame and takes it outside and burns it in the oil drum next to the barn. Nevertheless, the next day, he's back in the studio with a fresh canvas and starts again from scratch. In the case where a concept is judged, now let's imagine a philosopher. After a day's hard work of creating a system of philosophy, the philosopher steps back and perceives or apprehends what he or she sees. Now let's imagine the same scenario when a philosopher works with concepts rather than oils and canvas. In the case where the concept is judged to be a failure or not functioning adequately, causing the image of thought to collapse back into a chaos of shit and mud, of contingent relations, fragments of concepts, words, simple forms, fragmented sentences, hypothetical statements. What does the philosopher do? Unlike the painter, he or she cannot whitewash the surface to start over again from scratch the next day, or basically pull out a fresh canvas, since the concepts themselves are actually etched into the plane of immanence and can never be removed. Particularly the a priori concepts or categories that are universal and necessary concepts that are located just beneath the plane itself. It is here that we might understand the difference between critique and creation is nothing thus than a forced choice that the philosopher must make in response to this situation, which is why Deleuze and Guattari define the manner of creating concepts as a species of constructionism. To construct, to reconstruct. In other words, the only manner of creating a new concept is by cutting up the plane itself, then reassembling it by adding a new component or subtracting an old one, adjoining a different zone or neighboring concept, inserting a threshold or a bridge between two entirely different regions of experience, just as in the case of the creation of a priori analytic and synthetic concepts in Kant. So in other words, this is very much an image of what they are referring to, is that you have to find a way to create by actually cutting up the plane of immanence and therefore rearranging the concepts as a manner of creation in philosophy. But how is the manner of rectifying concepts through creating different from the Kantian solution? Upon first glance, the different is not so easy to discern. Does not Kant begin the Critique of Pure Reason by exhibiting the same practice of cutting up or cross-cutting a previous plane of metaphysics that is already populated with all the concepts since Aristotle, and then by reassembling the plane according to a specific order that is determined by the logic of the unified system that he's creating? It is according to this demand that Deleuze in the early seminar identifies the Critique of Pure Reason as a machine. And once again, my guess is that Deleuze came to this intuition of the machinic nature of the Kantian system while writing the book on Kafka with Guattari a year earlier, particularly the way Kafka treated the components of his writing, the letters, the diaries, the aphorisms, the stories, and novels, is part of an overall assemblage that was constantly breaking down and could only be repaired by rearranging the components to function together. In other words, it was Kafka's method of creating a new plan or plane of immanence for the assemblage to continue to function adequately that led Deleuze's insight concerning how the creation of concepts is a solution to the problematic of philosophy as well. As I will show, this insight is especially critical for understanding Kant's approach to the problem of metaphysics. For example, does not Kant say that to repair the state of metaphysics, which has never worked or functioned adequately, as he says in the introduction, we cannot simply be satisfied with dissecting previous concepts analytically, but must also expand our cognition by adding new concepts. Quote, in order to do this, he says, we must use principles which go beyond the given concept and add something which is not contained in it. And by means of such a priori synthetic judgments, we must presumably go so far beyond such concepts that actual or possible experience cannot follow us. So there's a really beautiful moment when he says we have to go beyond the concepts, but by adding components or bridging an aspect or adding to the concept something that it had never previously contained and cannot be deduced from the concept itself. And of course, the a priori synthetic cognitions or concepts are time and space. Okay, and that's what he comes to not deduce, but synthetically produce by creating two new concepts in the arsenal of metaphysics, which are the a priori synthetic judgments. Okay. At this point, I'm going to skip quite a bit, just because I don't want to go too long, and because I fear that if I dive back into the transcendental aesthetic too long, that I'll lose the whole audience pretty quickly. So let me move to the transcendental logic, basically, which is where you have the categories. So in my talk or in the text, I go through and demonstrate how Kant actually creates the concepts of the a priori synthetic judgment, even though he later on says, well, they're not concepts because they're not analytically defined or deduced. They're not categories. They are conditions or grounds of concepts. But at the beginning, he defines them as concepts in the first edition. Later on, he revises his definition of these things. So I kind of go over these finer points to say, yeah, these are concepts that actually Kant created, and then later redefined as conditions. But let me go to the second part, which is the transcendental logic, which is book 2. But only to quickly illustrate the second aspect of what I just mentioned, the notion of concept creation as constructionism, which is a cross-cutting, a cutting up of the plane of immanence that's already populated by concepts and rearranging that plane in some way that philosophy does. As Deleuze and Guattari say at the beginning of the second chapter of their book, constructivism has two qualitatively different complementary aspects, the creation of concepts and the laying out of a plane. For example, recalling my earlier example, the difference between creation and philosophy and the artist, like Pollock, Philosopher cannot start over from scratch with a blank canvas, since the plane is already littered with concepts left by previous philosophers. Of course, this is not a rigorous example of how an artist is also confronted by a canvas that is already full of dominant figures and cliches. There is no such thing as a blank canvas. When Klee looked at a canvas, when Cézanne looked at canvas, it was already populated by too many cliches. And so artists also have to cut, but they do it in a different style, or they have a different manner or technique of, in a sense, destroying the figures. And philosophy does no different, but they have to destroy the concepts, break them up, and reconstruct them in a different way. And so we're trying to find the particular technique that philosophy uses. So, of course, this is not a rigorous example. An artist is also confronted by a canvas that is already full of dominant figures, like figuration or figure itself, that are already etched into it, which must then be deformed, disfigured, violently torn out, discarded by a new definition of the figure, and especially made visible in the example of Pollock's method of disfiguration or painting. However, in the case of philosophical constructionism, or the construction of a new plane of immanence, an image of thought, the method of constructionism resembles what Deleuze and Guattari call cutting or cross-cutting of the plane. Since they also define the plane itself as only constituted by concept, there is no way to cut up the plane except by cutting into the concepts and rearranging them. As they say, the only regions of the plane are concepts themselves, but the plane is all that holds them together, unquote. As I will now show, Kant's rearrangement of the fundamental, or what he calls the root concepts of metaphysics, the categories, is a perfect illustration of this reorientation or this reassemblage of the ground or as a plane, and a good example of the principle of constructionism. We began with the two properly created concepts, the concepts that correspond to the a priori synthetic judgments of time and space. In this case, we are dealing with what could be called found concepts. The a priori analytic concepts that correspond to the objects of experience, all experience, which have been called categories since Aristotle, from the Greek kategorein, which means to accuse, to judge, which means to call out in the open, in a public space, which is interesting. It has that aspect of judgment to it, accusation. To accuse someone is to categorize. And that's how we actually define things, is by categorizing them in a public space. Meaning even to chase out into the open. Consequently, their importance for Kant is obvious, given he defines thinking as merely the power of judging the object's experience by means of concepts already provided by reason. There is no thought without judgment and without the very public accusation of the objects of experience in order to chase them into the open, to make them public. Moreover, a priori analytic judgments are different from the synthetic concepts because they must contain their own predicates or attributes, unlike the synthetic concepts. Categories concern the concepts that contain predicates that must be accused or deduced as universal and necessary. And again, I'm kind of going over old ground here, but this is important just to illustrate. Now that we have defined the elements of the transcendental logic, let's survey the way these concepts litter the plane when Kant first arrived, to take stock of them, and immediately complains, as he does in the critique. He complains that they are so badly organized that he must reorganize them. Okay, this is a pretty funny statement. Or even that there is almost no organization to the categories at all. They are placed there haphazardly, arbitrarily, often in the order in which they were first found or experienced by previous philosophers, and particularly Aristotle. This unfortunate state is compounded by the fact that the concept of category itself later on fell into disrepute in the scholastic period of philosophy, and the Aristotelian ontology was later rejected by both Hobbes and Descartes. This judgment can be summarized by a statement by Arnauld during Descartes' time, that the categories of which so much mystery have been made help but slightly in the formation of judgment, the true end of logic. And he argues they are entirely arbitrary and founded on the imagination of one man who had no authority to prescribe them as a law to all of the others. So So in other words, it's the image of Aristotle as this subjective and arbitrary discoverer of categories that then becomes a law that we... So it's like living in somebody else's madness, okay, which is what Aristotelian philosophy is defined as. Consequently, if we said, following Deleuze, that Kant invented phenomenology in the Critique of Pure Reason, this is what Deleuze says, then in the second part we can say that he's the forerunner or the progenitor of a certain kind of structuralism that he finds underlying the categories and the manner in which he arranges them. He actually describes it in the letter. He arranges them like a language. Okay, it's a literal statement. And if you remember the Lacanian statement that he famously describes the unconscious is structured like a language, that we can see that he's applying a certain kind of Kantian principle to this notion of what is a structure. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to kind of like skip over any more detail. I've kind of listed this. At this point, now that I've described, so what I describe is that Kant then, as you can see, reorganizes all of the categories, which he says that were simply found by chance or in the order in which they were discovered by Aristotle, a bit like discovering Easter eggs in the garden, okay? You know, you have a concept of causality or something like that, that he completely reorganizes, of course, to the schema of the four categories or the four modes, the modality, relation, quantity, quality, and that's the manner in which he reorganizes the concepts on the plane of immanence so that they function within his system. At this point, let's now step back from the apparatus or machine or perhaps climb up on the ladder and view the table of categories like a canvas in Pollock's studio. What do we see? First, a plane that is populated by a priori categories, but these concepts are immanent to the plane in the sense that Kant gives to transcendental as both prior or outside empirical experience, but also both general and necessary to any possible experience of any object whatsoever. Possibility, which is a modality of judgment, is given as the priority or located as the basis of a new definition of the transcendental in terms of also modality. At the same time, we've also defined the two a priori concepts or two types of prior judgments. What would it mean to say that space and time don't exist, except that they don't exist like objects or like other concepts? The very mode of existing between possible, actual, and real is indiscernible in terms of the modality and constantly changing. It is here that we can see, again, a relation between Deleuze and Guattari's description of what he calls the mode of indiscernibility between these different states of the object that passes into a virtual and an actual state is a mode of indiscernibility that they find or basically relocate. By example, we might ask whether or not a priori synthetic judgments can be defined as modes of indiscernibility in terms of what Kant calls conditions. I will return to this question in a moment, but would simply point out that if you return to read the Transcendental Aesthetic or reread it in your own time, what I've already identified as the creation of these two concepts, you will always find a certain indiscernibility in how Kant defines them. Sometimes he calls space and time concepts, even though they lack the condition of being concepts provided by the understanding. Sometimes he calls space and time objects, even though they lack the condition of being objects of sensibility. This is especially prohibited in the Transcendental Logic, where we find Kant's famous statement. Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Although this would appear to introduce a contradiction of the two primary concepts defined above, what is remarkable is that Kant comes to the exact opposite conclusion. It bears on his definition, his new definition of the transcendental, which is what Kant creates, a new definition of the transcendental, which is clarified in a crucial comment that guides the entire construction of the relations between the faculties of the Critique of Pure Reason from that point on. If the reader is not attentive to this passage or does not understand its importance, they'll miss the whole book. Quote, "And here I shall make a," this is Kant, "and here I shall make a comment, extends its influence to all subsequent contemplations and hence must be remembered carefully. We must not call just any a priori cognition transcendental, but must call transcendental concerning possibility and the a priori use of cognition only the a priori cognition whereby we cognize that how certain presentations, intuitions, and concepts are applied or possible simply a priori. Neither space nor any a priori geometric determination of it is a transcendental presentation. So even mathematics is, in a sense, excluded from this notion of the transcendental. Okay, so let me move to the conclusion of my talk and get to the part where I return to Deleuze and Guattari. At this point, let us recall the question that I'm attempting to address, or have been attempting to address partially in the beginning. Is the difference between a method of critique and a method of creation of concepts, as what Deleuze early on calls the problem-solving manner that philosophy employs to correct or rectify the historical plane of concepts that they have inherited from previous philosophies. How do you fix a philosophy or the concepts that you've inherited? How do you think using those concepts? Once again, this fundamentally pertains to the question of grounding, in the sense that certain philosophers have attempted to resolve this problem by establishing a new ground, that is, a new beginning for philosophizing. And this also involved inevitably the creation of new concepts as their point of departure. And this is certainly in the case of the philosophies also of Leibniz and Descartes, but also the philosophers like Heidegger and Hegel, but also true of Kant, as we've demonstrated. The third problem ensues from the act of these grounders in the history of philosophy, a problem that directly pertains to the limits of the power of creation, which is the previous grounds that were established by certain philosophers, Descartes, Hegel, Kant, Leibniz, Aristotle, Plato, okay, that were established by philosophers remain in place for a very long time. This is the second problem of philosophy. A duration that sometimes appears like an eternity. In this regard, we have already demonstrated that subsequent philosophers simply cannot begin as if from a blank slate, and thus Deleuze and Guattari have defined the creation of concepts as more of a method of reorganizing, rearranging, and cutting up the previous plane of concepts. This limit is only exaggerated by their discovery that the plane and concepts that populate them bear an immanent relation to one another, which sometimes appears eternally like an eternally pre-existent plane, like being. Being of pure nature or a being of pure thought. This is what they refer to as the nature being or the thought being, of an indistinguishable plane in which concepts already populate. And it seems almost impossible, the act of changing planes entirely, that is, it's the impossibility of establishing actually a new ground, to begin philosophizing differently. So this is the problem that they address. The quasi-permanence of the ground has particularly been defined as a task of modern philosophy after the Kantian foundation. And this is why the duration that follows up to the present moment has been remarked especially in the contemporary period, beginning with Heidegger, by repeated calls or claims, for example, for the end of metaphysics, even though this claim is already present in Hegel's phenomenology and the creation of concept of history itself. Subsequently, this demand has become modulated to become the call for the end of the history of metaphysics, or logocentrism by Derrida, or by contrast as the claim to reject the metaphysical plane of concepts altogether, as in the solution of Wittgenstein and Russell, and the tradition of logical philosophy that has followed. And even Bergson belongs to this alternative tradition, to reject metaphysics altogether and all the concepts that populate it, as a way of beginning. It is this last alternative which could be said to be properly Nietzschean. A third alternative is to create a new style of philosophizing, which could be said to be properly Nietzschean, and in many ways influences the solution represented by Deleuze's philosophy, which is also influenced in a certain way by Bergson's claim to a new vitalism rather than a new logical form. Even changing the name of the plane of concepts, as I said, though, by calling it immanent rather than transcendent, is a certain kind of performative aspect of making a claim. It's kind of like, I will call this plane immanent, and then we believe something has changed. But in fact, nothing has changed until we actually understand what has changed. More importantly, Deleuze seeks to displace the role of critique and the priority of the understanding as the power to establish the rules regulating the creation of new concepts, to represent any possible experience. This is the very power of the critical understanding that will become the source of future antagonisms with Kantian critical philosophy, and in many ways with the Kantian conceptual persona of Kant himself, as a legislator or a judge of experience. In this regard, we could simply replace Aristotle with Kant in Arnold's earlier complaint that no ordinary person should be given the power to establish the rules for making judgments for everyone else. Has this not been the basis of most of the contemporary rejections of Kant's philosophy, even today? Of course, this does not determine the content of judgment or its power, which is left free and undetermined since it's subjective, but rather only establishes a certain form of judgment in analogy with legal, juridical image of thought. And it's precisely this juridical image of critical philosophy and the new role that Kant assigns to the tribunal of reason that introduces a fundamental tension within different claims or modern images of thought, that we seek to always escape the notion of reason as a tribunal or as a judge, okay, of experience. Okay, so now I'll now go to the end. I believe in response to this virulent problematic with Kant and the Kantian image of thought, or the notion of critical understanding as judgment, or the notion of judgment as a juridical notion of judgment and as a legal notion of judgment, or as a certain kind of logical notion of judgment, which in a sense is taken up by real powers, socially, culturally, in the form of law, in the form of medicine, psychiatry, certain kinds of powers that affect judgment on experience and organize and accuse experience, meaning to categorize experience. In response to the above passage, I believe it's crucial to observe that many of the most recent philosophical claims, for example, by speculative realism, by new materialism, by object-oriented ontology, are all held hostage by a certain subject-object relation in thought. And it is for this reason, and for their own passivity to this relation, that by a kind of foreclosure of this relation itself, that they claim to have established the supposed distance from the subject and object, either by bracketing or rejecting the innate givenness of the object's relation to the interiority of the subject, the so-called correlationism of the object and subject of the subject in mea su, or the innate interiority of the objects or other non-human forms of givenness to the world, the rejection of both the phenomenological inwardness of consciousness or the Heideggerian relationship between Dasein and Wert. In other words, in terms of the exposure of certain kinds of forms of non-human givenness in the animal, in objects, and other things. In most cases, by the total rejection of language, sign, and structure as the privileged form of the relation between subject, object, and predicate. The destruction of the notion of structure as standing for the transcendental opening of the subject to being. Thus, it is equally interesting to observe that most of these new methods seem to proceed through a new, invigorated claim to more technologically refined theories of scientific functions, or by a kind of analytic rigor of propositional logic to establish their perspective or point of view of a new ground, and to claim a new ground that is no longer subjective, no longer proceeding from the subject. What these new movements lack is a necessary relation to concepts. They do not create concepts. Or to a knowledge of the concept itself, because they do not proceed by concepts. Which is why they appear more like questions and answers to the problem that we've been pointing out all along. And why they often package their claim to novelty, oftentimes claiming novelty, by directly allying themselves with the modern sciences and new techniques in biology and animation and visualization, to say, in a sense, that they can claim a new manner of thinking, thinking experience, or thinking the image of thought. Quote, "We have the concept," they say. Look at the number of hits we have on Twitter, the popularity of our latest brand of philosophy, or the celebrity of our greatest innovators, unquote. It is this internal conflict to what is called, or was called, continental philosophy that was already prefigured in Deleuze's enmity for what he called the French Nouveau Philosophe. But the conflict has only increased recently in intensity, which is why Deleuze and Guattari always seem like, in comparison, like tired old men these days who never keep up the strength and the audacity of this new class of philosophical claimants. Oh, it is great time, quote, to be young in philosophy, says one. It is clear from the evolution of what Deleuze and Guattari call the prospect, the new form of proposition that is modeled on the functions borrowed from sciences and from digital forms that supplants the previous determination of the concept, that we have lost the ground of the concept of as well. That is to say, the specific manner in which thinking can any longer orient itself to the plane of sensibility, or what we simply call, or what Deleuze and Guattari call, le vécu, the lived. Not experience. They don't contain, the lived is not necessarily experience, but a sense of the lived, a feeling of the lived. This is why they say the confusion of the concept with the function drawn from science or technology has been disastrous, ruinous for philosophy. Philosophy has lost touch with the plane of immanence, as well with the knowledge of its own concepts, which it mistakes for functions and propositions. It was sensibility that gave the concept its specific consistency, forming the membrane that is placed between the inner and the outer dimensions of lived, and forming the very basis for a plane of immanence that is stretched across sensibility, and therefore the conditions of both subjectivity of time and space. And it's this membrane that is formed by the concept that we have lost today. We, meaning philosophy. As a result of this loss of this membrane, the concept loses contact, and I'm playing with the membrane also in the brain, the membranes that attach the different spheres of the brain together, and basically allows the synaptic contacts between the different aspects of the brain that constitutes thought. As a result of the loss of this membrane, the concept loses the contact with the psychological dimensions of the lived, its endoconsistency, as well as its adhesion to sociological dimensions of the lived, its exoconsistency. And this is a quote from Deleuze and Guattari. This membrane is what Meillassoux calls Kant's concept of correlationism. For example, as Deleuze and Guattari say, even possible worlds as conditions of reference are cut off from the concept of the other person that would give them consistency, since the existence of a possible world can be founded no more substantial than a proposition: John will arrive for dinner at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. At the same time, Deleuze and Guattari also hint that this state of affairs eventually leads us, according to a kind of Peircean notion, to a thirdness, a third zone, in which everything becomes strangely reversed, and we are now drawn back to the form of sensibility and feeling as an attempt to restore the immanent relation to a lived subjectivity. It is this third zone that we are provided with a new perspective or point of view on the missing ground, as I'm calling it, as well as for the plan or a new concept of grounding, the concept again on a sensibility of the lived, or what Peirce called an I feel of the synthetic judgment as a form of thirdness. And this is where I'll quote Deleuze and Guattari. If the world of the lived is like the earth, which must found and support the science and logic of state of affairs, it is clear that apparently the philosophical concepts are required to carry out this foundation, this grounding. The philosophical concept thus requires a belonging, quote, to a subject and no longer to a set. Not that the philosophical concept is to be confused with the merely lived, even if it is defined as a multiplicity of fusion or as an immanence of flow to the subject lived only furnishes variables, whereas concepts must still truly define true functions. These functions will have a reference only to the lived, as scientific functions have reference to state of affairs. Philosophical concepts will be functions of the lived, as scientific concepts or functions of these state of affairs. With this statement, if the world of the lived is like the earth, we find again the invocation of a deterritorialized earth as a new ground of geophilosophy, which they announce in What is Philosophy. And it is upon this deterritorialized earth that we dwell today. And though dwelling has a very different sense than it did for Heidegger, as I addressed in the earlier lectures to this series. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for this wonderful talk. And I would like to open the discussion right away, so please feel free to comment or to ask something, to develop some ideas that were presented. So, yes, Peter.
Thank you very much for a brilliant systematic lecture. I enjoyed it very much. And I do have one question. Since you mentioned Freud in the title of your talk, I wonder in what sense psychoanalysis creates concepts. Because obviously the psychoanalytic creation of concepts is different from the philosophical creation of concepts. And at the same time, psychoanalysis is not a science. It lays ground, obviously. As Foucault puts it, Freud was a father of discursivity in a sense that he opened up a domain that made possible not only consensus but also disagreement. And so psychoanalysis is based on a reflection on clinical practice, which is made possible by psychoanalytic theory. So I wonder, well, what do you think of the psychoanalytic metapsychology? In what sense can we call it even, creation concepts? Obviously, it was very creative endeavor. Freud was extremely fruitful author, influential at the same time. So what would be your reflection on the difference between psychoanalytic and philosophical creation of concepts?
Well, I mean, this is a very distinctive and different domain than Deleuze is invoking, for instance, in the notion of creation that he draws from the techniques of the arts, in his philosophy. And of course, the history of certain confrontation between psychoanalysis and Deleuze precisely around the role that the concept takes in psychoanalysis, that he would probably align or identify, and he does at certain points, with a more Kantian notion of a certain form of judgment, a certain form of a critique, that he sees the continuation of a critical use of concepts in psychoanalysis that in a sense is anti-productive, that produces a certain normative understanding of psychic life, okay? That he's always confronting with a wild and productive life of schizophrenic, where he identifies, for instance, Deleuze and Guattari identify the schizophrenics and as truly creative, and they make fun of Freud, the Freudian psychoanalysis, as he who enters into that experience of truly productive creation and seeks to limit and to judge and to categorize, therefore categorizing the forms of the different experiences of neurosis, hysteria, paranoia, and so forth, within a pseudoscientific form, okay? But I wouldn't be satisfied with that kind of negative or simply judgmental. There's a kind of very funny, burlesque relationship between Deleuze and psychoanalysis that is also in some way very respectful. But the question of, is psychoanalysis a science, is not really resolved, okay, by Freud himself, who constantly appealed to a certain kind of manner of understanding differently what constitutes the scientific function, the scientific knowledge of science. And this certainly is more exaggerated by Lacan and the Lacanian psychoanalytic knowledge or savoir in his complete opposition of psychoanalysis, not to science, but to philosophy. And Lacan, in a sense, was more concerned with opposing, for instance, the concepts of the metapsychology, particularly the Freudian concepts of the metapsychology, as, in a sense, as not philosophical concepts. So there's another distinction there. I'm not sure how to answer your question without going into a completely new development of what is the mode by which psychoanalysis operates in the metapsychology and how that is translated into clinical practice and how theory functions very differently in a way that philosophy does not utilize that kind of experience as a matter of forming judgment or evaluation. So let me think about that a little bit more and I'll come back to that question. Because
to be honest, this is a question that tortures me for a long time, and I find it fascinating and thought-provoking, because just if you think of a principle of validity in psychoanalysis, you know, what's the principle of validity of psychoanalytic concepts?
Yeah.
It's definitely different from the philosophical principle of validity. What's the measure of adequacy? So at least, you know, the psychoanalytic concepts pretend to make our lives better by the very power of their reflection, whereas philosophy has already abandoned this ambition makes our lives better, to make our lives better. So
at the same time, I would return to what I'm, you know, kind of the intuition that I have through the discovery of what is critique. What is the concern of what is a critical act? What is an act of critique? Is to purify the concept of erroneous or forms of error in reasoning. Okay, to purify the concept of previous determinations that are drawn from popular culture, mythic sources, literary sources. In some ways, to identify that Freud, in particular, could be understood as applying a critical method in the metapsychology, for instance, of purifying the fundamental psychoanalytic concepts that he carries forward in his teaching from the different manners in which they were appropriated by other schools, you know, of psychoanalysis, and the history of psychoanalysis itself is a constant war and antagonism over the concepts, over the purity of the concepts in terms of how they pertain. So, for instance, the war between object relations theory, or transitional objects in Winnicott and Klein, and basically Anna Freud, and the manner in which the institution of psychoanalysis itself is a critical institution at the most theoretical level in a certain kind of way that it's a Kantian manner of purifying its own concepts constantly, and those divisions, those distinctions, create different, definitively different schools or movements of psychoanalysis, right? Lacan's hostility to ego psychology of the United States and certainly of the UK, and and the role of the fundamental concepts that he draws out in the 70s in order to define the unconscious, in order to define the object, what is a drive, all of those things. The return to Freud is an invocation of a critical method of purity, which has that scientific form in some ways, but also a certain kind of philosophical form, I think a Kantian form.
I'm just thinking aloud, but for instance, it seems to me that there is even some kind of phenomenology in Freud. And in his autobiography, he says, well, there are three phenomena that are really important to me. It's repression, Drängung, importance of sexuality, including child sexuality, and dreams.
Yeah.
This is what really matters, and everything else is just metapsychology.
Yeah.
Everything else are just concepts that can be replaced anytime you offer me better concepts. And you know, this is fascinating approach to his own psychoanalytic theory, which can be labeled as phenomenological, and it fits into what you were saying with regard to Lacan, to this permanent self-criticism of psychoanalytic thought.
Well, and this is what I discovered in rereading with Deleuze the Critique of Pure Reason. It is to reattach the plane of, to define the plane of sensibility as the condition for both the evaluation and the legitimation of concepts. That basically the Kantian problem is that, well, we have a lot of metaphysical concepts, but they're not attached to, in a sense, we have to attach them to the plane of sensibility as the conditions for their legitimacy. Otherwise, they're not legitimate. Otherwise, they're metaphysical. And this is the derogatory notion of the metaphysical that was possible at that time by Kant. I think that Freud, that there's a similar movement of saying the dream sexuality, particularly of the body, of the corporate-ish, the relation of the body to sexuality, but the sexual formation of the body and its etiology, but also in repression and the symptom, the notion of the symptom. These are the phenomenon upon which all concepts must be based to be called psychoanalytic, you know, to be evaluated. And then the session, the metempsychology is when he gets together with a different analyst and basically they report their cases, that is, they report their phenomenon, and then they say, this is how I interpret it. And then there's a refinement of, well, you know, is the concept, is your interpretation properly grounded on the phenomenon? So I think that that's a different procedure, certainly. I mean, philosophers don't get together in a room, you know, and say, you know, here's my philosophical system today, okay? And basically, we all talk about, in a sense, the phenomenological basis of that, and then, well, phenomenologists do to a certain extent. But it would be kind of funny to think about that you're kind of an analytic session with other people and basically verifying the concept by, okay, how you properly grounded the sensibility. But that's a Kantian method of grounding the concept, of the grounding of the philosophy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question or comment? Yeah.
Jakob.
Okay, so you seems to identify the ground with a new beginning in philosophy.
Yeah.
But if you look at Kant, these are like the beginning of philosophy is something different from the ground, from the ultimate ground. The beginning is the plain fact that all knowledge begins with the experience.
Yeah.
And the ultimate ground is the transcendental subject.
Yeah.
Like the thing. So why can you identify these two? And my second question: why the ground must be objective? Why it cannot be subjective like in Kant or in Hegel?
Well, I mean, I would say, in terms of how Deleuze approaches that question as well, is that Kant established a new meaning or a new determination of the ground itself by making that distinction between an ultimate beginning of everything and then the experience as a ground, or the sensible condition of experience as a ground. It's that division or that distinction that is very Kantian. And he says, after that, when I said the new ground, I said that this belongs to a more contemporary or modern philosophy that followed Kant, that saw, in a sense, that repeated that problem and called or invoked for a new grounding, right? That, in a sense, was different than Kant's, or, in a sense, different from the transcendental subject that Kant established. And even the transcendental subject, which has been always, of course, as you know, Jakob, misunderstood, okay, as the transcendental unity of apperception is in shorthand the transcendental subject. But it has no relationship or it has no resemblance to the empirical subject as consciousness or the individual and so forth. And so that's oftentimes it's the analogy between the empirical basis of experience as interiority and so forth and the transcendental unity of apperception that constantly has been the call for a revision of that notion of it being improperly grounded. Okay? So I think that the more contemporary philosophies, and this is why I invoke, I mean, the end of metaphysics. What is this invocations? We need, from Heidegger onward, we need to bring closure, or we need to move outside or beyond the ground or the previous ground provided by metaphysics or the history of metaphysics, is a certain kind of response to the Kantian gesture or the act of grounding that then takes a historical form of temporality and, in a sense, restructures the manner in which we understand what it is to begin to philosophize. That's different from what Kant does in relation to Aristotle, right, and the previous tradition of metaphysics. I think it's very different. So this invocation of the new has been a refrain that's defined many contemporary or modern philosophies. I exaggerate it in the sense of the contemporary movements of speculative realism or new materialism and so forth. I exaggerate it, but I say that there's a repetition of a certain claim that they are beginning in a new way, right? Outside the transcendental subject, or without the transcendental subject, or beyond the transcendental subject. And that claim itself is a claim to a ground, which I say is illegitimate. I mean, you know, which I'm arguing is in some way illegitimate. Yeah.
So you don't argue that it must be objective, like?
No, I do not.
Like following Heidegger?
No, I do not. No. I mean, we have no idea of what the inwardness that Kant, you know, said. What is the interiority or the notion of insideness that constitutes phenomenology, or the phenomenon, or the world in Heidegger. In a sense, we have not. I do not demand that be an objective ground. Yeah, a lot of this was inspired by a rereading of Heidegger's, of course, Satzungsgrund, you know, the principle of grounding, or principle of ground. And what's interesting is that a part that I didn't lecture on today is that 1953, Deleuze conducts a seminar in University of Diderot, I think, I can't remember where he was. And very early, this was before Difference and Repetition, before his actual own philosophical work. And he conducts a seminar on the question of grounding. And it's at that moment that he really reads very carefully both Kant and Heidegger in order to establish his own relationship to this question. But fundamentally, you can see that he's a very, very close reader of both Kant and particularly Heidegger at that point. And then later on, you would not notice that he ever read Heidegger because he kind of wants to distance himself from Heidegger. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there another question or comment? Yeah, please.
Well, I'm not very familiar with Deleuze, unfortunately, but when you speak of philosophers such as Kant and describe him as creating his system as a defense against some sort of schizophrenia or something like that, so what does it mean for the content of his philosophy? Does it somehow undermine the possibility of the philosophy, or does it explicate, does it reinforce it? What's the point actually?
Only if you believe that we are purely logical beings and can fall into error by falling away from a pure logical system, right? Or that logic itself is not simply also, or can be understood as a defense against a certain kind of madness or reality of subjectivity, of the very condition of subjectivity, to create different versions of not only the external world but of the internal world and the ability to communicate them.
May I just have a quick follow-up?
Sure.
One thing that comes into my mind, given what you said about Deleuze, is Wittgenstein's notion of philosophy as a therapy. Have you thought of the relationship between maybe this Wittgensteinian notion and what you were talking about?
Philosophy is a heresy?
Therapy.
Therapy. Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, actually, this is why I mentioned the Kant. Kant if you've read the biography of Kant, you know that he was chronic hypochondriac and constantly, suffering illnesses, and was actually diagnosed after the fact later on that he showed symptoms or the signs in his later life of dementia precoce, so that is of a certain kind of formation of schizophrenia. And but he said that's why I made the comment that he said he went to doctors and found them completely useless, right? He said the only thing that is going to help me is philosophy in becoming, in maintaining my mental health, okay? I think that in the Wittgensteinian sense, and particularly what I know of Wittgenstein, I know more the earlier Wittgenstein. Yeah, I think that if you think about, for instance, there is, well, certainly in the proper use or the purification of a certain kind of language or linguistic system and side system, picture-making system, then of aspects that in a sense that could be said to be causes of pain, causes of illness, causes of suffering, then in a sense that you could see that philosophy would be a form of therapy. Okay? It depends on, in a sense, the tools by which we create in order to treat the mind. Okay? And I think Wittgenstein thought about that philosophy should be pragmatically defined rather than defined epistemologically or metaphysically. That pragmatically, what we do when we do philosophy or why we do it.
Maybe, can we say that every philosopher tries to treat himself or herself by his own or her own philosophy, so it cannot be like generalized for other people to be treated, but it's just a personal grounding in a way, or...
But this is an interesting question for me, because then I would say is then why don't we all have our own philosophies?
Yeah, yeah. We have schools, we have movements, we have followers.
So we treat ourselves with the mind of another, and that returns to Arnold's rejection or critique of Aristotle's definition of the creation of the metaphysical categories in Aristotle, is that no one man out of his own mind has the power, the authority to create rules that govern everybody else's thinking. And but that's in fact what happened, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we take on a system, and I always try to exaggerate in my work, okay, as a way to provoke, but also to illustrate, to demonstrate by taking the most extreme measure, is that, like, why I described that in the Kantian system, the minute you understand the I is no longer yours, but is the I produced by the system of understanding according to the rules set forth by the Kantian system. And if we understand that, then the I is merely an effect of an apparatus or a machine that thinks in our place. And I think that's how Deleuze understood. And that's a certain way of understanding, a way of creating a normative reality, that we're all basically part of the same machine that thinks identically the same. And maybe for some, that might be a reassuring aspect of, in a sense, a representation of normalcy, or a common reality. Certainly possible. But it was terrifying for Deleuze to consider, right? And that was a part of his allergic reaction to Kant. Now, I'm not saying that Kant is, that the minute that you read Kant, or basically apply Kant to perception and begin to use the rules that Kant prescribes to understand reason, understanding, imagination, according to the rules, that in a sense that you simply become a machine or a thinking machine, but in a sense that's a way that Deleuze understood the Kantian system and the danger of the Kantian system. And by those neo-Kantians and positivists who actually believed that basically the only way to think is to think the way that Kant defined thinking and according to the rules that Kant laid down. Okay? And everybody who thinks differently was insane. Okay? Or crazy, or committing an error, even an error. Oh, well, that's just an error in thinking. You're not thinking correctly. Well, how do we do that? How do we make that judgment? That's what's interesting to me. But come back to your question, is like, if everybody was just creating their own philosophy, I say, why isn't everybody creating? What is it? The power that we lack is the power that we believe, the power to create our own philosophy, to apply to ourselves. Which is why we always resort to another's philosophy to apply to us, you know. So, but I don't know what it would mean that everybody lived in a world in which they created their own philosophy. I really don't know what that means. So this is just an extreme example of two ways of thinking. Either we live in a system in which everybody thinks identically because it's all one system and nobody is the I is always the other, or we live in a universe in which everybody's created their own philosophy, okay, good, and they don't ever live in the common reality, right? You know, so. But these are philosophical extremes, right?
No?
Huh? That's schizophrenic. Yeah, that's schizophrenic. But then Deleuze and Guattari are not afraid of it. You know, they're kind of like they embrace it, that power or that possibility of an extreme pluralization or multiplicity of different realities, knowing that there's something that is resistant that does not make that possible, right? You know, there's something that, in a sense, institutes a certain common subject, whether it's the transcendental subject or not.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, I'm a little crazy too. So I know people look at me and go like, "Yeah, this is crazy."
Yeah,
No,
it's
I
for
agree
longer
with you. I'm just like, I feel relaxed.
Yeah, okay, well, good.
Speaking this way, and I realize it's difficult to. We all want the answer, but it's difficult to find it.
Yeah.
We can only philosoph around it. You know how you say it in English. So.
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
for
yeah,
longer
this is
discussion, maybe just trying to point out something. But
and we're all circling around the drain of our interiority, right? Trying to all figure out the same thing, okay? And we have, we're trying to find the tools in order to do that. But we're all looking at the same void, okay? That I began with, the void. It's either the castle or it's the void within us, you know. Or it's just, maybe it's just, the void is the same thing.
the fog.
The fog. We say the fog of interiority, you know, so yeah. Well, that's a good way to end.
Yeah, okay. Or maybe, I don't know. Is there some other question, important suggestion or something that you really want to say? You have the chance now, so the last chance. No? Okay, so maybe you can continue during the lunch, or you can join us if you want. So thank you, Greg, very much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you,
very rich.
Thank you.